Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A friend of mine who I really admire, he's a very successful recruiter in Toronto, recently posted an article about Twitter looking for a new CEO and how it's actually not mission impossible. It could be an opportunity of a lifetime. And it was really an interesting article about what Twitter should be looking for in a CEO. So I want to introduce you all to Jay Rosenzweig, who is with Rosenzweig and Company, as I mentioned, a recruiting company here in Toronto, and they are a global company recruiting top executives and board members, and he's very involved in a bunch of charitable works. But tonight we're going to be talking about hiring a high-profile CEO. Jay, why did you write this thing about mission impossible or opportunity of a lifetime?
Well, I saw a lot of talk about Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and lots of speculation about whether or not he's the right individual to actually lead the company into greener pastures. For many reasons, people question that for many reasons, including the fact that he's running two other very, very significant businesses. Obviously, one being Tesla, the other one being SpaceX. So even from a capacity point of view, some wondered whether or not this is something that he could properly take on. And then, of course, there was all kinds of controversy around some of the quick moves that he made and a lot of the departures. So I thought, given where I sit in terms of being a leadership strategist, that perhaps I could chime in on what the best approach might be.
And what do you think that approach is?
So I think for an organization with this level of complexity and issues that it's facing, including the fact that it's not a profitable business, even though it's a very prominent and well-known business with, I think, 360 million individuals on the platform, that one needs to really step back and try to understand really what are the symptoms here? What are the issues that we need to dive into in order to sort of stabilize the patient, if you will, and then understand really from a strategic point of view, what are the avenues that we could work on to take the business into the right direction and into profitability. And once we understand the business objectives of a client of that nature, then we can step back even further and develop a research strategy designed to meet the business issues at play.
I thought one of your opening paragraphs where you said, it's like giving this impossible assignment. It's like giving a kamikaze pilot a 2-ship quota.
Exactly. I think Twitter's reached the point where there's no longer any room for error. And I think if Elon were to think about this logically, he'd want to take the kind of approach where you cut once, but you cut properly from the point of view of tailoring a proper solution to take the leadership into the right direction. So from my perspective, it's not necessarily about the usual suspects out there, as an example. So all kinds of names like Sheryl Sandberg, former COO of Facebook, are being bandied about. I think it's a matter of really taking the right steps to develop a customized research strategy of individuals who may not be the obvious suspects. Like, as an example, I remember years ago, IBM was in trouble. The leadership, in terms of board of directors and whatnot, took an interesting leap outside of the tech world and hired a guy named Lou Gerstner, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
Former McKinsey consultant, former Nabisco and Amex executive, who really didn't have that Silicon Valley tech experience, but he was the right person for the right time. And I have some examples in my own experience in recruitment where really thinking a little bit more broadly and taking that step back can result in bringing in really the best possible candidate for the job.
You don't think that to run Twitter, you'd need to have someone that has got the creds in Silicon Valley and in the tech world?
Not necessarily. It might be, and perhaps, as we call it kind of internally at the office, perhaps tech professionals would be category A in terms of our research strategy, but not necessarily. I'll give you another example outside of tech. I remember a banking client coming to me and lamenting the fact that he couldn't uncover the right kind of marketing executive for the bank. He had worked with some of the big recruiting firms and hired some presumably great candidates on the marketing side, but they never seemed to bring something different to the table. And he was looking to really innovate. So I asked him at the time, well, where are these candidates coming from? And his response was, well, they're coming from the banking sector. They're coming from competitors. To which I said, well, if you're looking to really innovate, perhaps that's not the right place to be. What's the focus of marketing within a bank? It's the retail operations. Maybe you should be looking at the Gap and other true retailers who are eons ahead of you in terms of the kind of marketing innovations that they bring to the table. And sure enough, we took on the project and brought them someone from a true retailer. And the client indicated to me that he's never made a better hire. So sometimes
Really,
it's better to kind of go out of the box, if you will, as the cliche goes, under certain circumstances.
You talk about the banking industry. Bank of Nova Scotia brought in a board member, I think, as the CEO this past year, December or November. And a lot of people were quite critical of that in the marketplace, saying that was completely illogical, coming in, albeit a board member with no banking background. And so you're saying, actually, even though people were critical, it might have been a smart decision.
Sometimes the counterintuitive move could end up resulting in a huge home run. You just can't predict it, and who knows? Maybe in the Scotiabank example, that will ring true. What I always recommend to my clients, to draw like a sports analogy, if you will, is to really draft great athletes, because great athletes will eventually find their groove and often end up being the best possible hires that you can make.
I think everyone wants to do that rebuilding in a hockey team or whatever and draft those athletes. Yeah. But don't you have to trade for the winners in the end?
Not necessarily. It depends on the context, and it depends on the particular scenario. Sometimes a first-round draft pick could be even more powerful than the side trades that you make.
No, I agree with you. And as you know, I've been involved in hockey a couple of times past in my career. I think you build the base on those draft picks, and there's no question about that. But I think example after example means in the end, to really get to the Stanley Cup or whatever the equivalent is in another sport, you may need to trade for those last couple of spots and pay up. And people over and over do that, whether it's the Raptors a couple of years ago that built a great draft base and then had to trade for the guy that ended up, being the star in the end. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Jay Rosenzweig, talking a little bit more about Twitter and their challenges and what they should be doing, and Elon Musk and whether he is the solution to Twitter's woes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is hiring for a big company, a tech company, but I think it's applicable to a lot of other scenarios as well. And we may touch on this sort of another issue that's come up in regards to CEOs that are sort of bigger than life and that have this big image. And some people are saying that when you get a CEO, and it's been really evident in the tech world in the last couple of months, a CEO that ends up being a megalomaniac or narcissistic or whatever you want to call the words, and ends up being sort of more public and higher profile than the company itself. Is that good or is that bad? Some people in the past used to say, if you buy a hockey team or a sports team, you get on a magazine and you win a big award, sell that stock because the CEO is more interested in his own profile, less interested in the profit of the company. Not sure if that's true, but I heard that once. Anyway, my guest tonight is Jay Rosenzweig. He is the founder, CEO of Rosenzweig and Company, a recruiting company here in Toronto. He recruits people globally, does that at a very senior executive level and board level, and is very involved, as I mentioned earlier, in the charitable sector. And I've had the privilege of talking to him previously about some work he does in human rights and actually in anti-Black discrimination as well. And we may touch on that later. But Jay, I found it interesting in your article that you actually went through Twitter and some of their challenges, and you talked about stabilizing the patient and employees and the big amount of staff that the Twitter and Musk ended up firing. You talked about hate speech and the problem with that, and then you also talked about the struggle to monetize and create revenue. That's three, just off the top, three mighty challenges.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. First of all, the interesting thing is obviously Elon Musk is a different kind of duck, if you will. He went on Twitter and took a straw poll and basically said, look, I'm opening up this straw poll to the Twitter users, and yes or no is my question. Should I be the leader moving forward? And I'll abide by whatever the response is. And I think like 57 or 58% of respondents,
57.5% said yes.
said yes, you should step down and bring on a new CEO. It would require a really strong leader.
But then he said, no one wants the job that will keep it alive. There's no successor. So like right away, he went against his own tweet, his own agreement.
That's true. But I would argue he's wrong in that regard. I would argue the problem is he's not looking deep enough. The problem is he's not setting up a proper process to bring in the really great candidates. So you need a great leader to deal with issues such as, hate speech versus freedom of expression. How do I build this revenue model into one that's profitable? Like all of these issues are so incredibly deep and complex. How do I develop a motivated team to help me achieve all these qualities? So what I say in the paper is that essentially this could be an opportunity of a lifetime, because you're talking about a brand that's extremely well known. And can be leveraged. You're talking about a business that has 360 million users. So there's a massive opportunity here. But in addition to being growth oriented, as I say, this is the kind of leader who would need to come in, first of all, and stabilize the business. This could be an opportunity of a lifetime, or it could be mission impossible. Opportunity of a lifetime if Elon Musk gives the reins over to a great leader and gives him enough rope to be able to do his or her thing.
Do you think he's the type of leader, the type of CEO that can actually hand off responsibility to someone else? He seems to be one of these micromanagement kind of guys. That's
what worries me. I think the jury's still out. In fact, most might say that, this is an impossibility. Therefore, becoming CEO is mission impossible because he'll have his hands too deeply in the pie, such that a great leader wouldn't have the capability to build this thing into a win. So that's the big thing. It all hinges, for better or for worse, on Elon Musk's behavior, which is often mercurial, as I say in my paper. So that's the biggest challenge. If he could somehow be convinced to stay out of it to the extent possible, then it's the opportunity of a lifetime. Otherwise, as I say, it's mission impossible.
Now, when he first took over, he ended up exiting numerous different people, like a bulk of the workforce. Was that the right decision, do you think? And is that better or worse for an incoming potential CEO?
Well, as I understand it, he did dismiss or have individuals leave who are fundamental to security issues as it relates to Twitter, which stresses me out a little bit as a Twitter user, because I think he cut too much or cause others to leave that were important. And as I understand it, he actually went back to some individuals and asked them to come back. But that is kind of a small grouping of individuals who shouldn't have gone. But the thing that I marvel at is after all of these cuts, the application is still working perfectly fine. Twitter, I haven't seen many glitches on the day-to-day basis. So one wonders if in some of these larger tech companies, if there's a little bit too much, let's say, fat that can be carved off. And one wonders if there's a little bit too much waste. We've seen as well, Meta and Google recently dismiss a whole bunch of executives as well, given the uncertainty of our economy. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that Elon cut back on staff. I just wonder if this approach was reckless, and his recklessness, in fact, also spurred departures that he didn't even want.
I worked for Jim Pattison at one point in time, who was renowned for buying companies. And he used to have an adage that if you're going to do a restructuring, do it fast and do it deep, because you don't want people thinking there's another cut coming. You want people to be confident that the cut has been done and we're now back into growth stage. And so that would almost suggest that that what Musk did, which was dramatic, maybe a little bit too deep, but quick, was actually the right strategy. What do you think about that?
I think there is merit to it, absolutely. As I say, he may have been a bit reckless, but conceptually, I do agree with Pattison's point of view.
What about this issue of hate speech versus freedom of speech? It's been a big issue for a lot of Twitter users. Doesn't appear to be as big of an issue on some of the other social media platforms, and I think part of it is because of the ability to have anonymity in Twitter. Where do you come out on hate speech versus free speech?
So it's interesting, going back to my human rights work, as you know, I chair Erwin Kotler's Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Erwin happens to be an expert on hate speech. And in fact, I was just rereading this book, Striking a Balance, which Erwin contributed to, essentially analyzing the apparent contradiction between, for example, criminalizing hate propaganda and First Amendment rights, and in Canada, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms has our Section 2B, freedom, namely freedom of expression. I actually wrote like a 200-page paper in law school for Professor Kotler when I first met him on hate speech versus hate speech criminalization, Section 319 of the Canadian Criminal Code versus Section 2B of the Charter, and the apparent contradiction. And where we came out on it, and in fact, Professor Kotler litigated this in the Supreme Court of Canada. There was a case called Keekstra. Jim Keekstra out in Calgary was a high school teacher who taught his students that the Holocaust didn't happen. And he was prosecuted under Section 19 of the Canadian Criminal Code for hate speech. And the appeals went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. And it was a very, very seminal case, which went 5-4 in favor of upholding the Canadian criminal provision. And the justification, which Chief Justice Dixon actually gave in the majority opinion, was that the Holocaust didn't begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. These are the chilling facts of dangerous hate speech and incitement to violence. So it's a very fine line. Some of these organizations, including Facebook, have developed these third-party ethical committees who look at various cases that are on the line to decide what goes in and what goes out. It's not an exact science. There are many civil libertarians who are free speech absolutists. who argue that the marketplace of ideas allow all of this to be washed out. I'm not one who agrees with that. I'd be very, very careful with any speech that is limited, let alone criminalized. But there does come a point where incitement can lead to a very real threat of violence. We've seen that in Rwanda and other genocidal tragedies like that. And of course, the Holocaust itself, as I alluded to.
Well, my favorite American president, President Bartlett, you might know him, made some comment about that a true American had not only had to be able to salute the American flag, but to defend someone's right to burn it. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like that. Do you agree with that? Yeah. Is that you can desecrate your country's flag or the national anthem or something like that, and still is that freedom?
I think the analysis needs to be, is the action or the hate or the propaganda dangerous enough? Is the incitement dangerous enough that one can logically see threats of very real and very lethal violence? And that's a very, very difficult nexus to make. So that's the analysis you'd have to do. I haven't thought deeply enough about burning of flags to give you an answer on that specific example, but I think there'd have to be a real threat of violence coming out of the hate speech.
One of my friends just today on Facebook or Instagram posted something, I don't know what it was, because it had a little message saying this information is deemed to be incorrect by a fact checker. So that's not hate speech necessarily, but these are probably conspiracy theory kind of issues that someone is deeming inappropriate. Is that right for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to disallow?
I think that if it's simply incorrect information, if you have some sort of tab on top of it, like plastered onto the message saying this information is incorrect because, maybe in that case that's sufficient rather than banning a person for that kind of speech. Again, you'd have to assess on a case-by-case basis whether or not that untruth can produce a level of violence such that the individual would need to be banned.
The third issue that you raised, which is a really big one, is the lack of profitability. And I was astounded that you quoted that Twitter only gets 0.9% of online advertising dollars, and that even that, they went down 50% last year. What's the solution there? And that's got to be a huge challenge for any CEO that's running a company for a guy that just spent, what was it, $44 billion buying it?
Yeah, I find that extremely shocking. I honestly don't know the answer. We need to bring in an expert in new growth and generation to solve that, to crack that nut. But you would think a brand such as Twitter would be punching a little bit above that kind of weight versus competitors like Facebook and the like. I mean, it's absolutely astounding to me that the advertising dollars are not a lot higher compared to competitors. I simply don't know the answer.
So, a sample of one, but when I'm on YouTube or Facebook, I'm inundated with advertisements, probably also on Instagram. I made the mistake of probably looking at a condo for sale once, and I got every condo that's now for sale wherever I go that finds me on Instagram. I don't get that on Twitter. I don't get inundated with ads.
Yeah, well, you would think you would be. You probably should be. Someone's not doing their job properly.
We're going to take a break. And when we come back, I'm going to ask Jay about this. There's been a bunch of articles recently about these high profile CEOs and particularly in the tech world, and whether that's good for companies or bad for companies. Stay with us. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Jay Rosenzweig, who is the CEO founder of Rosenzweig and Company, a recruiting company here in Toronto that recruits senior executives, board members, etc. Jay's also very involved in charitable organizations, anti-Black racism, freedom, free speech, etc. Jay, I wonder if we can switch from talking about Twitter just for a second. There's been, a huge decline in tech stocks in the last little while. Huge number of layoffs or firings in tech companies of late. And there's been a couple of articles recently that say that part of the problem is that too many of these CEOs, and the big Bitcoin company is one example, but there's several others. The CEOs were too bent on building up their own image more than building up the company. And there was this old adage that some investors talked about, maybe it was 20 years ago, but that if a CEO got a big award, got on a magazine, bought a jet, bought a sports team, that's when you wanted to sell the stock, because the CEO was more interested in the perks of being a big shot than actually producing profit. Where do you come out? Should CEOs have big images, big brands on their own, or should they be, just working for the betterment of the company?
Well, I'll tell you what, like I'm pretty counterintuitive in terms of the traits that I look for in a leader for my clients. For me, humility is at the top of the list. So I think these articles, and you make a point in being a bit leery about leaders who have too big an ego. I like when I'm interviewing a candidate for a CEO job, I like to hear some humility. I like to hear them giving credit to their team for some of the accomplishments that they've had historically, giving credit to favorable market wins, whatever it might be. Of course, a healthy dose of ego is important when you're leading an enterprise, but if you have too much of an ego, you might struggle to ask for help. You might struggle to try to continue learning. Curiosity is another area that's extremely important to me as I assess candidates. So it does reach a point with certain leaders when they've experienced some success that they lose that edge.
Goes to their head.
I do think it's something that one needs to be very, very careful of when investing in a company. The kind of leader who's a little bit too much about themselves.
I've been reading a lot lately of people, management consultants and other people that think that empathy is this new trait that leaders should have, which is certainly not consistent with what the leader that we just described, or the type of leader we just described, or the leaders that we think of from a generation ago. Do you think leaders need to be empathetic, or do they need to be hard-nosed and driven?
I think the new leader of today needs to have a lot of empathy. It's a different kind of leader than, let's say, the leader of the past, who was banging their fist on the table, demanding results, and an intimidator. I don't think the new generation really responds to that kind of leader anymore. More and more, what I'm finding is, if you're a leader who thinks of his or her team as people that they are serving, that they need to understand from the point of view of what makes them tick, and have some empathy for where they're coming from and the things that they enjoy doing, and even empathy for their personal lives. If issues come up in a teammate's personal life, those are the kinds of individuals who, if you're there for them under those kinds of circumstances, they'll go to bat for you when the chips are down and you need them. So that's the kind of leader I think that would be most successful into the future.
You make the point in your article about Twitter that Elon Musk is running several companies, Twitter and a car company and SpaceX, etc. But most people would think of him as a micromanager. Do you look for micromanagement in a leader, or is that a bad trait in a leader?
In general, I think that micromanagement is not a good trait to have. I think you need to give your people rope to succeed and to come to you with wins and creativity that spurs wins. I take the approach that you assume optimistically within a certain amount of rope. Obviously, you can't put the whole enterprise at risk with a new team member, but give them as much rope as they possibly can take, and be optimistic that they'll succeed. And I think that's the way to motivate individuals to really even exceed their own expectations and do wonderful things for an enterprise.
If Elon Musk gave you a call and asked you to come and present Jay Rosenzweig and Rosenzweig and Company, and tell him how you would actually go about this search and what you would be looking for, what would you say?
I'd say to him that I'd need to first of all sit down with him and go through his perspective on the business, what its potential can be, what his vision is. And I would indicate to him that I would need to have a back and forth with him, and he'd need to respect my point of view as well, so that we can together, with any other stakeholders that he feels would need to provide input on business objectives. And once we have a clear understanding of what the business objectives are, I could then present to him a research strategy with categories of businesses and individuals who could fit the bill and help him fulfill his business objectives. And then we'd be off to the races on an extremely comprehensive process that I think he'd be very pleased with.
How long would it take?
It would take us about 2 months to develop the proper strategy, the proper targets and individuals that we'd want to approach. Probably another couple of months to bring in a long list of, let's say, 100 candidates who we feel could theoretically fit the bill, and do assessments. Given how senior the role is and the senior level of the leader, we might be taking them out of current business where they're currently employed, which would require all kinds of notice periods and the like. So I'd say optimistically, we can have a great candidate for them within 6 months. Possibly longer, but I'd say 6 months is realistic.
I went through one recruiting process where I did have a good recommendation to the individual, but sat down for dinner with the guy and he offered me the job that night. So it was a pretty short recruiting process. Another one that took probably 4 or 5 months, something like 6 rounds of interviews with 3 different levels of people, including a recruiter, so 4, and then a psychoanalysis, an aptitude analysis, recommendation, reference letters, etc. Took an unbelievable amount of time. Yeah. Which is the normal, which is better?
Well, I think you do have to be nimble. If it happens to be that early on you have a great candidate, and you need to move quickly on that candidate, or you might lose them, you grab them at the right time. But that means you're sacrificing process. That's okay every once in a while. So that would contract my search quite a bit. Theoretically, we can have someone in a month under those circumstances. But the issue here is Twitter is so much in the public eye, and there's so little confidence right now in that business that I think unless some extraordinary individual appears that you must have, I think it's important even to have the integrity of the process and the comprehensiveness of the process see its way through to the end. So I'd highly recommend that in this case.
And if you were a senior executive or even an intermediate executive and you thought that you could become the CEO of Twitter or the CEO of some other company, what would be your recommendation about how you'd go about applying for the job?
Well, that's a tough one because it's difficult, in Twitter's case to reach Elon. But what you would do is you would draft, in my opinion, a list of traits that you think would be required for a business like Twitter, for the right leader, and very methodically lay out how you fit that bill. and perhaps even draft a paper in terms of how you'd approach what your plan would be to take Twitter into the next levels of success. Maybe publish it publicly. Do your best to bring it to any Twitter executives you can get to, even through in-mails on LinkedIn. There's always a way to reach the right people if you hustle hard enough. But I think it would require a great deal of hustle.
Always a way to reach the right people if you hustle hard enough. That's a good adage.
Yeah, I strongly believe that. I mean, I've done that in my own business development activities and other other times when I aspired to develop a relationship with people who you may have thought years ago would have been unrealistic. Where there's a will, there's a way.
I had one recruiter tell me that cover letters were passé, and someone else say, no, resumes are past historical looking and cover letters are forward looking. They're the ways that you talk about the problems that the company has and the vision that you would bring to the company. What do you think?
I like cover letters very much. I think cover letters are super important. In fact, I always request a cover letter that I could forward, whether it's in a business development context, helping a business that I'm invested in get to the right investors or business people, or in the context of career. Because in a cover letter, you can really customize who you are, what you want to do, and why you think you add value to the individual I'm bringing your profile to. So I think cover letters are extremely important. Resumes are as well, but if you are very meticulous on LinkedIn, LinkedIn can really serve the same purpose as a resume.
I heard that something like 97% of jobs today are filled through LinkedIn and Indeed or something like that. Why is there still a reason for people like you to work?
Because at the most senior levels, you need a much more strategic approach. The very best leadership candidates are not applying for jobs on LinkedIn or some of these other apps that you're referring to. And we provide along the way a lot of advice to our clients and recommendations.
I interviewed an economist yesterday who thinks that this is going to be the year for the employee, that it's going to be bad for investors because he thinks interest rates are going to stay high and liquidity is going to be a challenge, et cetera. But that because inflation has been high and workers are now going to start catching up, but at the same time, unemployment is low, that it's going to be a great year for workers. What do you think?
Well, I hope so. I'm very sympathetic to workers, so I hope it's a good year for them. I think it's going to be a challenging year all around, including for founders of businesses and investors. I think valuations are going to be a lot lower. I think we're in for a rough year. I hope I'm wrong. But if one segment of society, namely the workers, are able to leverage the scenario and do well for themselves, then I think that's great.
Jay Rosenzweig of Rosenzweig Partners, recruiting company here in Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your insight.
It's been a pleasure. Lots of fun. Talk soon, Brian.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. Good night, everybody.